carried no bombs. It fired no guns. And yet, this silent American aircraft quietly decided where and when victory would come. High above the clouds, it flew alone, no escorts, no defenses, no second chances. Beneath it stretched a continent in flames, France, the Netherlands, Germany. Every mile of that sky was enemy territory. Every cloud could hide death. Yet the pilot's mission wasn't to destroy, it was to see. In 1943, war had become a machine that fed on uncertainty. Allied bombers filled the skies each morning, returning hours later battered, burned, or missing entirely. Many never found their targets. Some bombed empty fields or decoy factories. The problem wasn't bravery, it was blindness. The Allies didn't need more firepower. They needed information. Someone had to reveal the truth about what was happening beyond those clouds, where the bridges were, where the tanks hid, where the roads actually led. And to do that, they needed a new kind of soldier. He would not fight. He would observe. He would carry no guns, only cameras. And he would risk his life not for glory, but for clarity. The Army Air Forces began looking for a plane that could do the impossible: fly faster than enemy fighters, higher than flak guns, and steady enough to take crystal-clear photos at 30,000 feet. The engineers at Lockheed believed they already had the answer. It was a twin-engine fighter unlike anything else in the sky, the P-38 Lightning. At first, pilots laughed at it. The twin booms looked awkward, almost alien. German intelligence reports mocked it as two planes welded together. But those who flew it knew better. The P-38 climbed higher, flew farther, and turned faster than almost any other aircraft of its time. It was a masterpiece of balance and power, and it was about to be reborn. Lockheed's engineers stripped away everything that made it a fighter. The guns, the armor, the bulletproof glass gone. In their place, they installed Fairchild cameras, heated to survive the cold, thin air of the upper atmosphere. Film magazines replaced ammunition belts. The gun sights were rewired to operate lenses instead of machine guns. What emerged from the hangar looked familiar, but carried an entirely new purpose. Its name, the F-5 Lightning. A plane designed not to kill, but to know. Every ounce of weight saved became a little more speed, a little more altitude, a little more chance of coming home. Because this new aircraft would have no one watching its back. Its only weapon was distance and nerve. From that moment, the war gained a new front. One fought not with bullets, but with film. While others dropped bombs, these men dropped shadows of truth on the generals' desks back in England. They flew where radar couldn't reach and where maps still lied. Each mission began the same way: take off before dawn alone, climb until the sky turned from blue to black, set course across the channel, past the reach of friendly guns. Over the enemy's heartland, they switched on their cameras, flying perfectly straight, perfectly level, because even a small vibration could blur the image that thousands of soldiers depended on. There were no medals waiting for them when they landed, only rolls of film. But those films would become the eyes of D-Day, the maps of every bombing raid, and the proof of every victory that followed. The plane that dropped no bombs had just become the most dangerous aircraft in the world. By 1942, the Allied war machine was growing faster than ever before. Thousands of planes filled the skies, and yet, somehow, victory still seemed distant. Bombers flew brave missions across Europe, but too often they came home with nothing to show but empty bomb bays and empty seats. Generals had maps, but those maps were lies. Rivers had changed course. Roads had been bombed into dirt. German factories moved underground, hiding behind camouflage nets and fake rooftops. Even the best intelligence could be weeks old. In modern war, being blind meant being defeated. That was the world the F-5 Lightning was born into, a world desperate to see clearly again. Lockheed's engineers understood that guns alone could not win this kind of war. America had factories, manpower, and courage, but what it needed most was vision. They took the sleek P-38 fighter and began turning it into something entirely new. The idea came from a handful of officers in the U.S. Army Air Force's Photo Reconnaissance Branch. They asked a question that sounded almost foolish at first. What if we take the guns out of a fighter plane? Pilots laughed. Engineers hesitated. It went against every rule of combat aviation. But someone had the courage to say yes. Without the heavy machine guns, the plane lost over 800 pounds. Without armor, it shed hundreds more. The result was speed enough to outrun most German interceptors, and altitude enough to fly above their reach. It was no longer a weapon of destruction, but a weapon of discovery. The new aircraft received the name F-5, the reconnaissance version of the P-38 Lightning. It was fitted with precision Fairchild cameras mounted in the nose and under the belly, each able to capture high-resolution images from miles away. They were mechanical masterpieces, stabilized against turbulence and kept warm by electric heaters to stop the film from freezing. Each mission produced thousands of photographs, each frame worth more than any bullet fired that day. Bridges, bunkers, railways, oil refineries, all seen from angles no spy or soldier could reach. But flying these missions demanded a different kind of courage. A bomber pilot had his crew. A fighter pilot had his guns. The F-5 pilot had nothing but his engines and his will. Every sortie was flown alone, unarmed, deep into enemy skies. If spotted, there was no fighting back, only escape. Survival depended on precision, instinct, and luck. They learned to climb high above the clouds, then drop down in sudden dives to photograph their targets before vanishing into mist again. The Luftwaffe called them ghost planes. Invisible, untouchable, unpredictable. But the truth was they were fragile. A single hit could rip open their thin aluminum skin. If a coolant line burst or an engine failed, there was no backup. Many of these pilots never came home, their missions remaining unspoken secrets for decades. Still they flew, because every photograph brought the Allies closer to winning the war. By the end of 1943, entire squadrons of these unarmed aircraft were operating out of England, North Africa, and the Pacific. They scouted the beaches of France months before the invasion. They revealed secret submarine pens along the coast. They mapped enemy rail lines from Poland to Normandy. And all of it began with one risky idea that knowledge could be stronger than gunfire. The transformation of the P-38 into the F-5 proved that America's greatest strength wasn't only in its factories or its firepower. It was in its ability to rethink what fighting meant. This new machine didn't need to destroy its enemy to defeat him. It only needed to understand him. Every photograph that came back told the same silent truth: victory begins with vision. Each mission began the same way before dawn, when the airfields of England were still wrapped in fog and silence. The world was grey, cold, and waiting. Inside a narrow briefing room, a small group of pilots listened as officers pointed to maps marked with red circles and black arrows. Each circle meant danger radar stations, flak towers, fighter bases. Each line drawn across France or Belgium was a flight path that might not be flown twice. There was no talk of glory, no cheering squadrons, no patriotic speeches. The men who flew reconnaissance knew exactly what their odds were. They would fly alone, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, at altitudes where frost could seize the controls and a single mistake could end the mission. They didn't carry guns or bombs, only the hope that their cameras would come back full of truth. At the end of the table sat Captain John H. Ross, one of the most skilled reconnaissance pilots of the war. He was 24 years old, thin from exhaustion, but calm, the kind of calm that comes only from accepting risk completely. He had already flown dozens of missions over occupied France, returning with images that changed the way generals planned their battles. On this morning, his target was deep inside Germany, a railway junction outside Cologne that fed supplies to the front lines. The only way to reach it was to fly straight through the heart of enemy territory. Ross climbed into his F-5 Lightning, checked the gauges, and throttled forward. The twin engines roared, pulling the sleek machine down the runway. As the wheels left the ground, the world below vanished into mist. By the time he reached 10,000 feet, the sun was a pale coin in the east. At 20,000, the horizon curved. At 30,000, the air grew thin, the oxygen mask bit cold against his face, and frost crept across the inside of the canopy. He was completely alone, just two engines, a camera switch, and a sky big enough to swallow everything he knew. The crossing over the channel was the quietest part. It was only when he reached the French coast that the fear began to whisper. Radar operators on the ground would already be watching their screens, tracking a single bright dot moving fast and high. Within minutes, the flak guns would start their routine black bursts of smoke forming invisible walls in the sky. Ross kept climbing. The higher he went, the harder it was for the Germans to reach him, but the colder and thinner the air became. His gloves froze stiff on the controls. Every vibration could blur the film, so he steadied the aircraft with small, perfect movements. Over the Rhine, he spotted his target, the railway junction. It looked peaceful from 30,000 feet, almost fragile, as if the war had forgotten it. He turned on the cameras. The Fairchild lenses began to click, frame by frame. capturing every rail line, warehouse, and siding below. Then came the danger he always expected, but could never predict. 2 dots appeared behind him, German fighters climbing fast. They had seen him. Ross knew there was no use fighting. The F-5 had no guns, no way to shoot back. His only chance was altitude and speed. He pushed the throttles forward until the engine screamed. The aircraft shook violently, diving into a bank of clouds, using the grey cover as his shield. Flak bursts flashed like silent lightning around him. When he broke free of the clouds, the world was blue again. The enemy fighters were gone. He turned west toward home. But even the return was dangerous. Ice formed on the wings. Fuel ran low. One engine coughed and nearly died. After 6 hours in the air, the coastline of England appeared like a dream through the haze. Ross landed on the wet runway, the aircraft groaning as the wheels touched down. Ground crews ran toward him, shouting, their faces hidden behind fog and exhaust. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He climbed out, handed over the film canisters, and walked away. His work was done. Those rolls of film were rushed to the darkroom that same night. By morning, the photos lay on a long wooden table in London. Analysts leaned over them with magnifying glasses, tracing the lines of the railway, marking anti-aircraft positions, calculating strike points. Days later, Allied bombers hit the junction with perfect precision. The pilots who flew that mission never knew the man who gave them their target. They never saw the face of the pilot who risked everything so they could succeed. But that was the way these missions always were, unseen victories by unseen heroes. In the official reports, the photographs were labelled simply, "Taken by F-5 Lightning, pilot unarmed." But what they really were was proof that one unarmed man, alone in the sky, could change the course of a war. By the end of 1943, the Allies were preparing for something bigger than any single battle, the liberation of Europe itself. But victory couldn't be won by strength alone. It needed precision, timing, and knowledge. Every beach, every road, every gun position had to be understood before the first soldier stepped ashore. The entire future of the war depended on one question: where could an army land and live? The generals in London had a vision an invasion across the English Channel that would open a second front and break Hitler's hold on the continent. But between them and that dream stretched 150 miles of sea, defended by bunkers, minefields, and concrete fortresses built to destroy anyone who tried. The only way to outthink that fortress was to see it first. That task fell to the unarmed pilots of the F-5 Lightning. They began flying endless missions along the French coast. From Cherbourg to Le Havre, from Calais to Normandy, these pilots traced every curve of the shoreline, every village, every shadow that might hide a gun. They flew at dawn, when the light was soft enough for their cameras to capture detail without glare. They returned at night, exhausted and silent, their aircraft streaked with salt and frost. In total, they photographed more than 5,000 miles of coastline frame by frame, inch by inch. The result was the most detailed portrait of enemy defences ever created. Back in England, entire buildings were turned into photo interpretation centres. Teams of men and women sat under harsh lamps, piecing together the puzzle of occupied France. They spread thousands of overlapping photos across long tables, using rulers, magnifiers, and transparent overlays. When placed together, these images formed maps so detailed that analysts could spot tyre marks from German trucks and the faint outline of trenches hidden under camouflage. Every bomb target, every drop zone, every landing beach used in the D-Day invasion began as a photograph taken by an unarmed Lightning. One image captured by Captain Walter Gibb revealed strange shapes buried under sand near the Normandy coast. Analysts realized they were anti-tank obstacles, steel hedgehogs planted to destroy landing craft. Another photo taken by Lieutenant Charles Brown showed camouflaged artillery hidden behind hedgerows. Those guns would have torn through the invasion fleet if not for his discovery. For months, the F-5 pilots flew missions almost daily, their work hidden behind secrecy so deep that even other airmen didn't know who they were. When someone asked what they did, they would simply answer, mapping weather. But they weren't mapping clouds. They were mapping destiny. As the invasion approached, the danger grew worse. German radar crews had learned to watch for the twin-boom silhouette of the Lightning. Flak batteries tracked them mercilessly. Dozens of aircraft were lost, and their names quietly erased from records. Yet for every plane that didn't return, 2 more took off the next morning. By May 1944, the intelligence rooms in London were overflowing with photographs. The Allies now knew the exact strength of German defences along every inch of the coast. They saw where the enemy was strongest and where he was weak. One section of coastline stood out, a 50-mile stretch of beaches between Keene and Canton. The Germans had fortified it, but not as heavily as Calais, which they believed would be the real invasion site. Thanks to aerial photography, the Allies knew they were wrong. That strip of sand would become history's most famous battlefield, Normandy. In the final weeks before the invasion, F-5 Lightnings flew almost without rest. They mapped tides, sandbars, and beach gradients so engineers could predict which landing craft would sink and which would reach the shore. They photographed every road leading inland, every hedgerow where German tanks could hide. When dawn broke on June 6, 1944, more than 150,000 Allied troops crossed the Channel armed with weapons, courage, and the knowledge those pilots had gathered. As soldiers stormed the beaches, they found that the enemy's positions, gun nests, and minefields were exactly where the maps said they would be. The landings succeeded not by luck, but by information. Long after the invasion began, when victory was no longer in doubt, a British intelligence officer wrote a simple note pinned above his desk. It said, "Remember, before every bomb fell, before every ship sailed, a man in a plane saw it first." The pilots of the F-5 Lightning didn't fight on D-Day. They didn't drop a single bomb or fire a single shot. But without their eyes, the invasion of Normandy might have been a disaster. While the world remembers the soldiers who landed on the beaches, history often forgets the men who first mapped them. They flew unarmed, unseen, and uncelebrated, yet their courage gave an army its path to freedom. While Europe was being mapped from above, another kind of war was unfolding half a world away. The Pacific was vast, endless, and merciless. Here, the F-5 Lightning found a new purpose and new dangers far greater than flak or fighters. The war in the Pacific wasn't measured in miles, but in oceans. Between each island lay hundreds of miles of open water. There were no landmarks, no railways to follow, no cities to guide the way. Pilots could fly for hours and see nothing but waves. If an engine failed, there was nowhere to land, and rescue was often impossible. But the need for information was just as great. The Japanese Empire stretched from the Philippines to the jungles of Burma and the coral atolls of the Central Pacific. Every invasion, every naval operation, every bombing raid depended on knowing what waited ahead: airfields, ships, supply lines, and weather. And so, the F-5s followed the war east. From bases in New Guinea, the Philippines, and later Iwo Jima, they flew reconnaissance missions over some of the most dangerous skies on Earth. The weather was brutal, towering storms that could rip wings apart, sudden squalls that turned daylight into night. Temperatures in the cockpit swung from freezing cold to suffocating heat. But still, they flew. In the Pacific, the enemy was harder to find. The Japanese built airfields deep inside jungles and disguised them with palm leaves. They painted ships to blend into the sea and hid fuel depots under trees. Only aerial photographs could expose their tricks. One of the first to see this need was Colonel Neil Kirby, commander of the 348th Fighter Group. He realized that the same speed and toughness that made the Lightning deadly as a fighter could make it invaluable as a scout. Under his command, modified F-5 Lightnings began flying long-range photographic missions over enemy-held islands. The risks were enormous. A single mistake in navigation could mean flying out of fuel hundreds of miles from land. Tropical storms could swallow an aircraft in minutes. And yet, the photographs they brought back revealed vital details: hidden airfields, ammunition depots, convoys moving through jungle roads invisible from the ground. In one mission over the Philippines, Lieutenant John B. Jack West flew more than 1,500 miles round-trip, photographing Japanese installations on Luzon. He returned with images so sharp that Allied commanders could count individual planes parked under camouflage nets. Those photographs guided bombers that destroyed the airfields days later, clearing the skies for the American landings that followed. The Pacific demanded endurance. To reach far-off targets, pilots often flew 8 or 9 hours without rest. They carried extra oxygen tanks, emergency rations, and a small rubber raft, their only hope if they went down at sea. Many did not return. Yet the missions continued. The F-5 became the eyes of the island-hopping campaign. Every attack on a Japanese stronghold from New Guinea to Okinawa began with photographs taken by men who flew alone. Later in the war, reconnaissance versions of larger aircraft joined them, B-24s and B-29s fitted with cameras instead of bombs. These heavy photoplanes mapped Japan itself, flying over Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka under constant threat from anti-aircraft guns. The information they gathered was used to plan the final air offensives that would end the war. One of the last and most dangerous missions came just months before the atomic bombings. An F-13, the reconnaissance version of the B-29, photographed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in perfect detail. Those images would later be used to assess the targets for the first atomic strikes. The mission lasted more than 10 hours, and the crew returned shaken but alive. By 1945, the Pacific had become a web of American airfields. Every new island captured meant another base for the F-5s and their camera-equipped cousins. Their photographs mapped entire coastlines, charted enemy movements, and even tracked the damage after each bombing raid. The photographs weren't just tools, they were the record of the war itself. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, historians later realized that almost every major battle in the Pacific from the Solomon Islands to Okinawa had been planned using images taken by these unarmed aircraft. They had never dropped a single bomb. They had never fired a single bullet, but they had guided every plane that did. The pilots who flew those missions often said the same thing. The loneliness was the hardest part. No formation to follow, no radio calls, no squadron to protect you. Just an empty sky, a roaring engine, and the thought that below you, somewhere, an entire army was counting on your film, not to jam. They were not celebrated like fighter aces or bomber crews. Their names rarely appeared in newspapers, but generals knew the truth. Without them, there would have been no victories, only guesses. And across the wide Pacific, from coral reefs to volcanic peaks, the ghosts of those unarmed planes still linger in the sky, silent witnesses to the war they helped win, not by force, but by sight. By 1945, the war was no longer just about who had more soldiers or bigger bombs. It was about who knew more. The silent photographs returning from F-5 Lightnings and reconnaissance bombers began to tell a story that changed everything. Each roll of film carried thousands of tiny clues: the angle of a shadow revealing a hidden bunker, the faint outline of a submarine pen beneath camouflage, the new rail lines feeding a factory that wasn't supposed to exist. In dimly lit intelligence rooms across London, Pearl Harbor, and Washington, these images were laid out on tables like pieces of an enormous puzzle. Analysts compared photographs taken days apart, spotting changes invisible to the human eye in the chaos of war. A single truck track in one image, missing in another, could tell them where an entire division had moved. For the first time in history, an army could watch its enemy breathe. This was the birth of modern intelligence, when cameras became weapons of strategy. Commanders stopped guessing and started calculating. They knew where to strike, when to strike, and what to avoid. A single mission could save thousands of lives. In Europe, reconnaissance photos revealed the exact locations of Germany's secret V-1 and V-2 rocket bases, the weapons Hitler had promised would turn the tide. The F-5 pilots who found them did so by accident, noticing strange concrete shapes hidden in forests. Analysts realized they were launch ramps aimed straight at London. Within weeks, Allied bombers destroyed most of them, preventing what could have been a devastating second blitz. In Italy, photo intelligence spotted a series of bridges carrying vital German supplies north. They were bombed precisely, one after another, choking the enemy's retreat. In the Pacific, analysts studying photographs of Japanese harbors saw oil slicks spreading from ships under repair. That single detail revealed where Japan's fuel reserves were being stored. The United States focused its bombing raids on refineries and oil depots instead of factories, cutting off the empire's lifeblood. Knowledge had become the most powerful weapon on Earth. What made it even more extraordinary was the speed. Film from a mission could be developed, analyzed, and acted upon within 24 hours. Some missions even landed their planes directly beside command tents, so that generals could hold the negatives up to the light themselves. For the soldiers on the ground, it meant something very real. When they moved, they knew what lay ahead. They weren't walking into traps. They weren't guessing where artillery might come from. Somewhere above them, an unarmed pilot had already seen it all and brought the proof home. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later said that the success of the D-Day invasion and much of the war itself would have been impossible without aerial reconnaissance. British Commander Sir Arthur Tedder called it the most valuable form of air power ever devised. For centuries, armies fought blind. The F-5 changed that forever. Every modern satellite, every drone, every spy plane owes its existence to that idea that vision wins wars before the first shot is fired. The courage of those early reconnaissance pilots gave birth to a new age of warfare, one ruled by information instead of instinct. But there was something deeper behind it, something almost poetic. The plane that carried no weapons ended up being the most dangerous of all. It fought not by destroying, but by revealing. Every time it took off, it lifted more than a camera, it carried the truth. And in a world drowning in chaos, truth was priceless. When historians later reviewed the war's timeline, they noticed a strange pattern. Every major turning point, every decisive victory, had begun with a photograph. Before D-Day, photos of Normandy. Before the raids on Germany, photos of rocket sites. Before the island landings in the Pacific, photos of beaches, reefs, and enemy guns. And before the final bombings of Japan, photographs taken by men who flew alone, thousands of miles into hostile skies, armed only with courage. The war was still fought by soldiers, but it was won by eyes. In those final months, while nations celebrated victory and heroes returned home, the F-5 Lightnings were quietly retired. Their work was done. Their photographs, millions of them, were boxed and stored in archives, silent ghosts of a war once hidden in shadow. Most people never learned their names. But every commander who had ever planned a mission, every bomber crew that returned safely, every soldier who lived to see another day owed them everything. Wars end when truth replaces fear, and no machine ever delivered more truth than the plane that dropped no bombs, yet saw everything. They were called many things: ghost pilots, the invisible squadron, the men who flew without guns. But among themselves they had another name, the ones who came back quiet. There were no parades for reconnaissance pilots, no newspaper photos, no interviews, no medals pinned in public. Their missions were secret, their results classified. When they returned to base, they didn't boast about dogfights or victories. They simply handed over their film canisters, signed the report, and walked back into silence. Yet those who knew them understood. The ground crews, the intelligence officers, the generals, they all realized these were not ordinary men. To fly unarmed over enemy lines took a kind of courage that couldn't be taught. Captain John H. Ross once said, "It's not the fear of dying that gets you, it's knowing that you can't shoot back." Every mission meant putting absolute faith in your skill, your aircraft, and your luck. The F-5 Lightning had power and speed, but no armor. A single bullet through a fuel line could turn it into fire. If flak hit a wing, the plane might hold together for another minute, maybe two. If an engine failed over France or the Pacific, the pilot was on his own. There were no escorts, no radio rescue calls. One pilot wrote in his journal, "We fly alone so others don't have to die blind." That simple line captured everything about them. Many never came home. Their missions disappeared into official reports marked "missing, presumed lost." Some were shot down by German fighters who mistook them for bombers. Others ran out of fuel and vanished into the sea. A few crash-landed in enemy fields, captured with cameras instead of guns. But those who survived carried something different than medals. They carried memories and questions. Lieutenant Charles Brown flew over Normandy weeks before D-Day. He later said that when he saw the beaches full of Allied soldiers on June 6th, he couldn't stop thinking, "I was there first, but nobody will ever know." Others struggled with the weight of what their photographs had led to. They understood that each image meant precision bombing, and that meant destruction necessary, but heavy. One pilot described it like this: "You take a picture, and 2 days later, that picture is smoke. It's hard to be proud of that." And yet, they also knew their work saved lives. Every bridge destroyed on time meant fewer soldiers ambushed on the ground. Every accurate map meant fewer landing craft sunk. Every photograph prevented chaos. When the war ended, most of them returned to quiet lives. Some became airline pilots, others engineers, farmers, or teachers. A few stayed in the Air Force and helped build the next generation of reconnaissance aircraft. But none of them forgot the loneliness of those missions, the long hours of silence, the endless sky, the feeling of being both essential and invisible. Decades later, historians began uncovering their stories. Letters found in family attics, photographs in forgotten boxes, mission logs declassified at last. One by one, the names of the men who had flown unarmed began to reappear not as statistics, but as people. Their letters revealed humor, fear, and quiet pride. One wrote to his mother, "Don't worry about me, Mom. I fly too high for anyone to reach." Another wrote to his wife, "If you get a letter saying I'm missing, just know that I was doing what I loved, chasing the horizon." Even the way they described flight was poetic. One diary entry read, "At 30,000 feet, the world stops shouting. You feel like you're not at war at all, but then you remember why you're up there." For them, victory wasn't measured in enemy kills or medals. It was in the film safely delivered, in the missions that returned without loss, in the quiet knowledge that their courage gave others a chance to live. When they gathered years later at small reunions, they rarely spoke about fear. They spoke about light, the perfect light for photographs, the clarity of the morning sky, the strange beauty of enemy cities seen from above. One of them, now old and grey, summed it up best in an interview. "We didn't fight the war," he said softly. "We witnessed it. And maybe that's what someone had to do to watch, so that the world could learn." They were heroes who never asked to be called heroes. Their weapons were cameras, their missions invisible, their victories quiet. But without them, the war might never have been won because the world would have remained blind. When the guns finally went silent, the world began to count what it had lost and what it had learned. Out of the ruins came a new understanding of war. That sight was stronger than strength, and information could change everything. The F-5 Lightning had proved that power wasn't just measured in explosions, but in understanding. It had flown without armor, without bombs, and yet it had shaped every major victory of the war. From Europe's beaches to the jungles of the Pacific, its cameras had guided armies, saved lives, and revealed truths hidden beneath smoke and steel. After 1945, the world changed. Nations that had fought in darkness now raced to see farther than ever before. The lessons learned from the F-5 became the foundation of a new era, the age of reconnaissance. Out of those same ideas came the U-2 spy plane, soaring twice as high as the F-5 ever could, capturing photographs from the edge of space. Then came the SR-71 Blackbird, faster than a rifle bullet, its sleek black frame born from the same belief that to see first is to win first. Every modern drone, every satellite orbiting above the Earth, every camera aimed at gathering intelligence, all of them are descendants of that unarmed Lightning. The plane that once flew alone over Europe and the Pacific became the ancestor of an entire philosophy. Wars are not won by fire alone, but by foresight. Historians now look back and call it one of the most important aircraft of World War II. Yet in its own time, it was hardly noticed. Most of its pilots went home in silence, their missions locked away behind classified walls. Some never learned how crucial their photographs were. Decades later, when those images were finally released, they were astonished to discover how many battles their work had made possible. But their legacy was not just military, it was human. The F-5 taught the world that bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly through thin air at 30,000 feet, holding a camera steady while flak explodes below. It showed that technology and humanity could work together not just to destroy, but to reveal. Every photograph taken from those high altitudes was a reminder that truth has power, that a single image could prevent 1,000 deaths or change the course of history. When peace came, many of the surviving F-5s were scrapped or forgotten. But a few were preserved in museums, their silver wings polished, their noses still holding the empty mounts where the cameras once sat. Visitors walked past them without realizing that this was the aircraft that made D-Day possible, that revealed Japan's defenses, that turned chaos into clarity. Beneath those quiet exhibits, plaques read simple words: "Unarmed reconnaissance aircraft, Lockheed F-5 Lightning." Nothing more. Yet if the machines could speak, they would tell of storms, fear, and the strange beauty of flying alone into danger armed only with curiosity. In the decades that followed, the spirit of those missions lived on in every reconnaissance pilot who ever took off without weapons, in the U-2 pilots gliding through the stratosphere during the Cold War, in the SR-71 crews racing across hostile skies, in modern drone operators guiding unarmed craft through invisible wars of information. They all inherit the same unspoken truth. The first victory is knowing. And even now, in an age of satellites and instant data, the lesson remains. Behind every decision, every strategy, every defense, there is still someone or something seeing first. The F-5 Lightning will never be remembered for its kill count or its speed records. Its greatness lies in something far quieter, its ability to give others the gift of sight when it mattered most. It dropped no bombs, it fired no bullets, but it gave the world a way to see, and in doing so, it helped to end the darkest war humanity had ever known. In the end, that may be the purest form of victory.